While President Trump was announcing new tariff threats this morning, the real history was being made 7,000 miles away in New Delhi. The European Union and India just signed what both sides are calling the mother of all trade deals. It covers 25% of the global economy. It links 2 billion people. And the United States wasn't even invited to observe. Let me be very clear about what just happened. This isn't a trade agreement in the traditional sense. This is the architecture of a new global economy, one where the United States is no longer at the center, one where the dollar is optional, and one where America's threats carry less weight than they did 24 hours ago. What you are witnessing isn't a trade dispute. It is the eviction of the United States from the Eurasian economy. The headlines will tell you this is about tariffs, about market access, about regulatory harmonization. That's all true. But it's also entirely beside the point. Because the real story, the one that will define the next decade of global commerce, is buried in the fine print. And that fine print reveals something Washington never saw coming. The world didn't need us as much as we thought it did. And now it's proving it. I spent this morning reading through the text of the New Delhi Agreement, all 800 pages of it, and one clause kept jumping out at me. It's buried in Chapter 14, the section on financial services and payments. The language is technical, bureaucratic, the kind of prose designed to put lawyers to sleep. But what it actually says is this: India and the European Union will conduct the majority of their bilateral trade using local currency settlement. That means rupees and euros, not dollars. Transactions will flow through special Rupee Vostro accounts held in Indian banks, allowing European firms to pay Indian exporters directly in local currency without ever touching the U.S. financial system. This is the mechanism. This is how you bypass the dollar without making a big public show of it. You don't announce that you're abandoning the global reserve currency. You just stop using it. Transaction by transaction. Invoice by invoice. And here's the part that should terrify anyone paying attention in Washington. This infrastructure already exists. It's been tested. India used this exact system to buy discounted Russian oil when the United States tried to sanction Moscow out of the global energy market. India used it to purchase food from the UAE. And now, in January 2026, they're scaling it up to handle trade with the world's largest economic bloc. The European Union represents 500 million consumers with a combined GDP of roughly $18 trillion. India is the world's fastest-growing major economy, projected to hit 6.5% growth this year, while the U.S. struggles to maintain 2%. Together, they've just created a $24 trillion market that operates independently of New York, independently of SWIFT, and independently of the Federal Reserve. Let me put that in perspective. The USMCA, the trade agreement linking the United States, Mexico, and Canada, covers about 500 million people. The India-EU deal covers 2 billion, 4 times as many consumers. And while the USMCA economies are mature, slow-growing, and increasingly fragmented by political dysfunction, the India-EU bloc is young, dynamic, and explicitly designed to promote strategic autonomy. That phrase keeps appearing in the official statements. Strategic autonomy. It's diplomatic language, polite, neutral-sounding. But what it actually means is, we don't want to depend on the United States anymore. We don't trust Washington to be a stable partner. And we're building systems that let us ignore American pressure. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, said it explicitly at the signing ceremony. This agreement offers reliability and long-term partnership, not alignment by pressure, but cooperation by choice. That's not a random turn of phrase. That's a direct shot at the transactional diplomacy coming out of the Trump administration. Europe is saying we've had enough. And India? Prime Minister Modi called this a double engine of growth that empowers our shared commitment to democracy and the rule of law, independent of any singular global power. Independent. That's the word that matters. India isn't choosing sides between the U.S. and China. India is choosing itself, and is doing it with the backing of the European Union. So what does this actually look like in practice? Let me walk you through the sectors where American companies just lost their competitive edge overnight. Start with aerospace. Under the new agreement, India eliminates all tariffs on aircraft, spacecraft, and aerospace components imported from the European Union. Zero. That means Airbus, the European aerospace giant, now has a massive price advantage over Boeing. For decades, American manufacturers dominated the Indian aviation market. That's over. When Air India or Indigo need to modernize their fleets, they're going to be buying European. Move to automobiles. India just agreed to slash tariffs on luxury European cars from 110% down to 10%. That's a 90% reduction. And it's managed through a quota system that allows 250,000 high-end vehicles annually. BMW, Mercedes-Benz, 80. These companies now have preferential access to the Indian market that Ford, GM, and Tesla simply don't have. But here's the clever part. Electric vehicles are excluded from the initial tariff cuts. For the first 5 years, India is protecting its domestic EV industry, giving companies like Tata Motors and Mahindra time to scale up before European competition arrives. This isn't free trade. This is industrial strategy. India is using market access to build its own manufacturing base, and Europe is accepting that trade-off because it wants the Indian market badly enough to wait. Then there's pharmaceuticals. India is the pharmacy of the world. It produces more generic medicines than any other country. And the United States, under pressure from big pharma lobbyists, has spent years trying to force India to adopt stricter patent protections, longer data exclusivity periods, and rules that would make generics more expensive. Europe tried too, but in the final negotiation, India said no. The agreement preserves India's sovereign right to produce affordable generic medicines the moment a patent expires. No extensions, no evergreening. And Europe accepted it. Because Europe understands that access to affordable medicine is a national security issue, not just a profit center for pharmaceutical companies. American negotiators would never have agreed to that. And that's exactly why India chose Europe over the United States. Now, if you want to know whether this realignment is real, don't ask a politician. Ask the gold market. On January 26, 2026, gold blew past $5,000 per ounce. $5,111 to be precise. That's not a typo. Gold has more than doubled in less than 2 years. And on the same day that the India-EU deal was announced, silver broke through $100 per ounce for the first time in modern history. This isn't inflation. This is a vote of no confidence. Because here's what gold and silver prices actually measure. They measure trust, specifically trust in the institutions that manage the global financial system. And right now, that trust is collapsing. On January 11, 2026, it was revealed that Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, is under criminal investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice. The stated reason is cost overruns on a $2.5 billion renovation of the Fed's headquarters. The real reason, everyone in Washington knows, is to create a pretext for removing Powell before his term expires. The moment that news broke, gold surged. Because markets understand what this means. If the President of the United States can use the Justice Department to threaten the independence of the Federal Reserve, then the dollar is no longer backed by institutional credibility. It's backed by political convenience. And political convenience changes every 4 years. Central banks around the world are reading the same signals. In January 2026, global central bank gold reserves hit $4 trillion for the first time in history. That's more than the value of U.S. Treasury bonds held in reserve for the first time since 1996. Think about what that means. Central banks are supposed to hold dollars. That's been the foundation of the international monetary system since Bretton Woods in 1944. But now, they're selling treasuries and buying gold. The Reserve Bank of India cut its U.S. bond holdings to $174 billion, a 26% drop from peak levels. India now holds only 33% of its reserves in dollar assets, down from 40% a year ago. And it's not just India. Poland just approved the purchase of an additional 150 tons of gold. Kazakhstan is the largest buyer in the market. China has been adding to its gold reserves for 13 consecutive months. These aren't tactical moves. This is a strategic reorientation. The technical term for what's happening is de-risking. For years, Western governments talked about de-risking from China, reducing dependence on Chinese supply chains, diversifying away from Beijing's economic leverage. But in 2026, the phrase has flipped. Now, middle powers are de-risking from the United States. Japan, one of America's closest allies, is openly discussing the need to reconsider the reorganization of supply chains to reduce exposure to U.S. policy volatility. The European Union has codified this in its European Economic Security Strategy, which now applies de-risking protocols to all advanced economies where excessive concentration poses a risk. Not just adversaries, all advanced economies. including the United States. When your closest allies start treating you like a systemic risk, you've lost something fundamental. You've lost trust. We have been here before. And the historical parallel is not encouraging. In 1932, the British Empire convened an emergency economic conference in Ottawa. The goal was to create a closed trading bloc, an imperial preference system that would insulate Commonwealth nations from the chaos of the Great Depression and the trade wars triggered by America's Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Britain was still the world's dominant naval power. London was still the financial capital of the world. The pound sterling was still a global reserve currency, and the empire still controlled a quarter of the Earth's land surface. But beneath the surface, the system was already dying. The Ottawa Agreements tried to defy economic gravity by forcing trade to flow along political lines rather than natural commercial patterns. It didn't work. Within a decade, the sterling bloc had collapsed. The empire had been bankrupted by World War II, and the United States had replaced Britain as the global hegemon. The lesson isn't that empires fall because they're invaded. The lesson is that empires fall because they're bypassed. When the world no longer needs your currency, when your markets are no longer essential, when your rules no longer govern commerce, your power evaporates. And that's what's happening right now. The India-EU agreement isn't an invasion, it's a bypass. It's the construction of a parallel system that functions without American participation, a system where the dollar is optional, where SWIFT can be replaced by direct bilateral settlement, where trade flows around American tariffs instead of through them. The gold price isn't measuring inflation, it's measuring the end of American monetary dominance. The exorbitant privilege, the ability of the United States to print dollars and have the world accept them as payment, is evaporating in real time. So, what happens next? Let me walk you through the scenario if this new bloc holds. Phase 1 is already underway. De-dollarization, more trade settled in rupees, euros, yuan, and other currencies, fewer transactions flowing through New York. The Federal Reserve's ability to use interest rates to influence global capital flows diminishes. The dollar doesn't collapse overnight, but it slowly loses its monopoly. Phase 2 is supply chain redirection. European companies that were using the United States as a manufacturing hub or a distribution center start routing through India instead. Why pay tariffs to sell into the American market when you can sell tariff-free into a market of 2 billion people with faster growth rates? Manufacturing capacity that might have gone to Texas or Ohio goes to Maharashtra or Gujarat instead. Phase 3 is technology decoupling. Right now, the global tech stack is dominated by American platforms. AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud. But if the India-EU bloc creates regulatory frameworks that prioritize data sovereignty, European and Indian companies will build alternatives. The digital economy fragments, and American tech companies lose access to a quarter of the global market. Phase 4 is the consumer impact. Americans start noticing that goods are more expensive and harder to find, because global supply chains have been optimized for decades to flow through the United States. When those chains reroute, inefficiencies appear. The stuff you used to buy at Target or Walmart either costs more or isn't available. And your paycheck doesn't go as far as it used to. Phase 5 is the geopolitical consequences. If America can't offer market access and can't offer currency stability, what exactly are we offering our allies? Military protection? Fine. But military alliances without economic integration are brittle. They fracture under pressure. And when that happens, the regional security architecture that has prevented major power wars since 1945 starts to crumble. This isn't speculation. This is the logical progression of the choices being made right now in Washington, New Delhi, and Brussels. And the truly frustrating part? It didn't have to be this way. The United States could have led the transition to a multipolar trading system. We could have worked with Europe and India to create frameworks that respected sovereignty while maintaining open commerce. We could have reformed the WTO instead of abandoning it. We could have negotiated from a position of strength instead of threatening from a position of insecurity. But instead, we chose tariffs. We chose coercion. We chose to treat allies like adversaries and adversaries like enemies. And now, the allies have decided they don't need us anymore. The India-EU agreement isn't a rejection of the rules-based international order. It's an attempt to preserve that order without the United States, because Washington has made it very clear that the rules no longer apply to us. We'll freeze Russian assets. We'll sanction European companies. We'll threaten Canada with 100% tariffs if they sign a trade deal with China. We'll treat Denmark like an adversary over Greenland. And Europe and India looked at that behavior and said, we need a backup plan. This agreement is the backup plan. Let me be very clear about something. I'm not celebrating this. I'm not happy that American influence is declining. I'm not rooting for the dollar to lose its reserve status. Because when the global monetary system fractures, everyone suffers. Trade becomes more expensive, investment becomes more risky. The probability of conflict increases. But whether I'm happy about it or not is irrelevant. It's happening. And pretending it isn't happening doesn't change the reality. The map has changed. The economic geography of the world is being redrawn, and the United States is no longer at the center of that map. So what do you do with that information? First, understand that the America First rhetoric is producing an America Alone reality. Isolation isn't strength, it's vulnerability. When you cut yourself off from the global economy, you don't become independent, you become irrelevant. Second, recognize that this isn't a left versus right issue. This is a competence issue. Trade policy shouldn't be made by presidential decree at 3 a.m. on Twitter. It should be the result of careful analysis, consultation with industry, and negotiation with partners. The chaos we're seeing isn't a feature, it's a failure. Third, if you're an investor, diversify. If your entire portfolio is in U.S. equities and dollar-denominated bonds, you're betting everything on the assumption that American institutional stability will hold. That's a riskier bet today than it was 5 years ago. Consider exposure to European markets, Indian markets, hard assets like gold. Because the world is fragmenting and concentrated bets become dangerous in fragmented environments. Fourth, if you're a business owner, start thinking about how your supply chains function in a world where the India-EU corridor is the growth engine and the U.S. market is stagnant. That might mean establishing operations in Europe or India. It might mean accepting that your competitive advantage is eroding. Either way, ignoring the shift won't make it go away. And fifth, if you're a citizen, this is a moment to engage. Because the decisions being made right now in Washington are setting the trajectory for the next generation. If you care about American prosperity, if you care about our role in the world, if you care about whether your children inherit an economy that works, you need to make your voice heard. Call your representatives. Demand actual strategy instead of slogans. Push back against policies that feel good in the moment, but destroy our credibility in the long run. The India-EU agreement is a wake-up call. It's a signal that the world is moving on. With us or without us, we can choose to adapt, to rebuild relationships, to compete on the basis of innovation and productivity rather than threats and tariffs. Or we can choose to double down, to isolate further, to pretend that the old rules still apply. But we can't choose to stop the clock. The mother of all deals has been signed. The new corridors are being built. And the question isn't whether the world is changing. The question is whether America changes with it. The era of unchallenged American economic dominance lasted roughly 75 years. From the end of World War II to the signing ceremony in New Delhi. That's a pretty good run, historically speaking. But it's over. And what comes next depends entirely on whether we have the wisdom to recognize that and the courage to do something about it.